This is incredible. Oh my God. I definitely did not know the number of people to expect, but this is pretty awesome that so many of you are here and committed to learning about issues of racial justice. So I hope that you take something from this program. If not know me, my name is Mara Simon, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Physical Education and Health Education. Okay. And so I'm just trying to get people in here. I would give it like one more minute while we get everyone in. Thanks for your patience. Okay, I'm just letting everybody know that I am going to record this. I think all the sessions are being recorded, so just a heads up that that is happening now, and I will, keep letting people in, but we'll get started because it's 1:32 and you're here for an hour, and so I wanted to make the use of our time together. And so, this is a session which is intended to explore the ideas of, sport, racism, and social justice. And, together we'll sort of go through some examples and what that, sort of means and looks like both historically and in present day. Okay, so to start, I thought that we would just do a quick activity because, just sitting here listening to me talk is not that interesting. And so what I'm going to do is put a link to the Jamboard in the chat. And, sorry, give me a sec. And it is, if you've never used Jamboard before, it's essentially, we're going to create like a visual representation, and it's really easy to use. So there's that. I have a couple more people in the waiting room.
No. No.
Give me one sec. Everyone get in here. Okay.
Nope.
And so what I'm asking for you to do is, I'm sorry, just trying to focus here for a second. I'm sorry, they need to be out of here. Right now, guys, you need to be out of here. Sorry. Thank you. Right now. Thank you. Working from home.
This presenter, she's like a big professor, is about to give her talk, and her two kids about your age just ran into the room, and she's like,
yep, that is exactly what just happened. And welcome to my life and my world. It's all good. If anyone has kids or pets you want to share on this Zoom, bring them in. Let me see them. I'm here for it. All right, so I just kicked them out, so now we'll be good. Break the ice a little bit. All right, so here's the prompt, right? Is to simply add an image to the Jamboard that represents sport and social justice. And I'll show you really quickly how to do this, okay? So we go over to the Jamboard, and you just add your image here, okay? So you can go here to image, and then if you have one, you can do that, or you can search here and type whatever, and you'll find images, and then you can just click add, and you can play around with it. in terms of, positioning and size. And you can also add a sticky note with any text if you want. Okay, so essentially what we're doing is we're creating as a group like a visual representation of our, what we might think of when I give you the terms sport and social justice. So I'm going to keep letting people in as you all start doing that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a second page because we have, again, like way more people than I was expecting. So we can go on to another page and even a third page. So we can create like 3 pages if we want of images of sport and social justice. All right, so I'll give you like 1 more minute to get through that. And then we'll look at what we've created and we'll start to think. So if you're not sure, if you notice up at the top, there's little arrows so you can flip from screen to screen. So we can start to spread our images out a little bit and then so we can really see them all, which I think is very powerful. And the link, for those of you who are asking, the link to the Jamboard is in the chat. Come get in on this action, please. We want you all to be a participant. Good. Sorry, Sherry. So if you go to the Jamboard, on the left-hand side, there's like this image with the mountains and it says add image. If you click it, you can either upload your own image or do a Google search and it will bring stuff up from you. All right, I guess there is a limit. Again, definitely never expected so many of us here, but we can stop there. I'm sorry, if you can't get on, you can wait till somebody clicks out and then you can go back in. But I really just wanted to create like a visual representation of what we might think about when we're thinking about sport and social justice, and what does that mean, and who is it related to, and what does that mean for our thinking and our time together today. And so what I'm seeing here is a number of protests, right? So not only images of patriotism right in the middle, I see like the flag, but bringing up the issue of, Native representation in sport, which is really important. I see players kneeling, presumably during the national anthem. I see Colin Kaepernick, who we're going to talk about, and lots of really, I think, powerful images of the ways in which sport has been used as a vehicle for social justice, which is really what the focus is here, that for today is thinking about how sport can be a means of working towards social change and also reflective of, broader societal issues. Okay, so I also see on the third page of the Jamboard, there is the image of John Carlos and Tommy Smith, the Olympians who raised their fists, and we're going to talk about them a little bit more coming up. And then so many images from this summer. This summer was such a time of social unrest, and that is represented through sport protest and social justice. So we are going to get all the way up to current times, hopefully, if I can take us through. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and come back to, the PowerPoint. But thank you for those of you who participated. Again, I'll save this Jamboard, and I just think looking at the visual of the ways in which sport and social justice intersect is a really sort of important starting point for us. Okay, so thank you for that. And come back here. All right. And so before we kind of dive in, I thought it was important to establish, what the ways in which I'm operating, or the framework that I'm operating from. And so, when I started to think about this session, what really jumped out to me was like the specific forms of anti-Black racism that I was seeing, in these examples of sport and social justice intersections. And so that, as I started to like zoom in, right? Zoom, we all zoom all the time. That is what really emerged as I was trying to create, think about what I wanted to, present in this topic today. And so when we think about anti-Blackness, the things that we're going to think about is this idea of critical race theory when it's applied to sport, which is the ideas that sport are not neutral or apolitical, that there's a history of oppression and marginalization for athletes of color, but at the same time, sport has presented opportunities for athletes to reclaim their power and sense of selves through athletics. And yet specifically, historically, there have been many forms of anti-Blackness in sport. And so those are really like important things to keep in mind as we work through these examples. And then from there, I started thinking about the idea of colorism, which is a way of approaching like whiteness, in how, whiteness is often positioned at the center, and that the closer to whiteness, quote unquote, the more normalized or better, even though like according to whiteness. And so in that way, Black athletes experienced attention because, they were playing at times during formal segregation, but also have experienced, this commodification and exploitation of their athletic abilities, right? So there's this sort of way of thinking about, historically Black athletes in sport, as not being, say, one of us, but also we want your skill and your athleticism to do great things for our teams. So this is the framework for the ideas that I'm going to present today. And the other thing that I wanted to mention is that I'm trying really hard to keep this talk focused on Black athletes. And so I'm going to use a decent number, hopefully, of video clips. So rather than a white woman talking about Black athletes, we'll let Black athletes talk for themselves. Okay? So this is where I'm coming from, this idea that like many racial and ethnic groups have experienced oppression and marginalization. That is not to say that other groups have not, that Latinx and Asian American and Native peoples have not experienced oppression and marginalization in sport. They absolutely have. But there is a specific way in which Black people in particular have experienced sport that has attention. All right, so to sort of illustrate that, I wanted to look first, I did some breakdown looking at like what are, considered right now, say, Black male sports. And right, when we think about the NBA, 80% of the players are Black, 26% of coaches are Black, and there's only one that I could find owner of a team who is Black, and that's Michael Jordan. And then the NFL, 70% of players are Black, 20% of coaches are Black, and 0% of the owners are Black. Now, it's definitely possible that some of this information is dated, so if I'm wrong and you're more knowledgeable about this, please correct me. But you can see there is an overwhelming majority of players who are Black, but as we go up in the ranks, those numbers drop. And so my question for you all, I really wanted this to be more interactive than me just talking the whole time. So like, what do these numbers alone? We're looking at these numbers. What do they tell us about race and power in sport? Just thinking about, right, NBA and NFL are probably the two most, and the MLB are like the most famous leagues in the US. What do these numbers tell us? Can anyone offer any interpretation of this?
Yes, hello, Maria. My name is Terry. I'm calling from Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Welcome.
I'm an older student. I'm in my 60s. And when I looked at 26% of coaches being black in the NBA and 20% of coaches being black in the NFL, I've been a person who's been involved in organized sports my entire life. And I can tell you, wow, 26%. That's a lot more than I ever knew before, because there were no black coaches at the professional level of the NBA or the NFL for the majority of my childhood, my teenage life, and my young adulthood. So these numbers are probably more indicative of more recent times when they began to think that black males involved in sports could actually think as well as they could perform.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that perspective. I think that is an important one to note, that perhaps in some ways the coaches in particular represent some progress when we think about, say, the last 40 years of sport. It might be important to think about, before, say, Jackie Robinson, quote unquote, broke the color barrier in 1947, there were in baseball, at least, it was the Major League Baseball, and then there was, I think the league was called the Negro League. And so at that point, probably in the Negro League, all the coaches were identified as black. And so when we integrated, we lost perhaps a lot of coaches. Just like Title IX, we saw a loss of women coaches. So you're right that this represents progress, and I agree. And there's not, my point of view is that there is these go hand in hand, that on the one hand, sport has been a vehicle for social justice and social change, but on the other hand, it has represented times of oppression and marginalization and open racism towards athletes. So it's both. And you pointing this out, from what you've seen and lived, is perfect. That's exactly what I think, you make a really important point. I want to note that Jennifer points out in the chat, that at the ownership level, that there really isn't a seat at the table for black people. So I think this idea of shut up and dribble or shut up and play is perhaps highlighted in these numbers, as well as, the intersection of race, class, and power, right? That who gets to make decisions and who gets to put those decisions into action are really made by white people. So we can see that there is a clear differential or power structure, I would argue, amongst sports. And so what we want to perhaps might be useful is to go back in time a little bit and think about, what are some historical examples of black athletes who have experienced both racism and empowerment? And so the one I want to start with is Jack Johnson, who is a famous boxer. Okay, he was somebody who had his heyday at the height of Jim Crow laws, and he was actually arrested in violation of the Mann Act, convicted, served a year in prison with an all-white jury and an openly racist judge. Now, it's kind of an interesting intersection here, because the judge in his case was Kennesaw Mountain Landis, who would go on to become the Major League Baseball commissioner and was a very strong, openly segregationist. So there we start to see how these things interconnect. And so the first thing I wanted to show was just a little clip about Jack Johnson. So we will watch that and then we'll come back. So give me 1 second.
Jack Johnson was the first African American to ever become a world champion, but learning about his journey.
All right. 1 second. Sorry. There we go.
That belt was shocking. It's unbelievable as to how intolerant people were in his era. In many places of the world today, instances range from bad to horrible to even unbelievable. But to say the least. The level that occurred towards Johnson and his people was just on another level of surreal. A look back in history often glints insight into a very, very disgusting place. I couldn't process how comfortable the world was in their treatment of Johnson, yet despite that, every time he was slurred, hated, all he ever did was smile. All he ever did was remain playful, yet not provocative to an extent where he'd degrade anyone else. His composition was cool, yet beneath all of it, there was this deep sadness. You could tell he was just a man who wanted to live freely. This was the same motivation Muhammad Ali possessed. Ali had said if he replaced women and religion, the story between me and Jack Johnson is exactly the same. The freedom to be oneself, to express oneself as one's own man, to love oneself in a world that gains from another's low self-perception. All of it is an act of rebellion. Understanding this, it is a paradox of this reality. If your intentions come from a true, genuine place, a matter not of our trauma and insecurity, but a deep, deep yearning from our heart. Even if they are selfish, the residual is always shaking up the world with good. For more than 13 years, Jack Johnson was the most famous and the most notorious African American on earth, all because he fearlessly pursued his yearning for freedom. His life was risked at every instant, yet all you saw was this same smile. Even if he was morbidly depressed, even if he thought constantly of taking his own life, especially after becoming a world champion, it was just that much pressure. He would...
All right, I'm going to stop it there. So, Jack Johnson, right, is a really good example, I think, of, somebody who found an incredible amount of success in his sport, but experienced really open and intense levels of racism, and it deeply impacted him. And yet he continued, as the little clip just said, to really live his life the way that he wanted to, even as he was criticized. And so it was, one of his most famous fights is billed as the Great White Hope, which there was actually a couple of different movies and documentaries produced about, if you're interested in learning more about that. This was really done with the sole intention of fulfilling his racist white opponent's beliefs in white superiority. And when he won, there was, race riots across the country. So it was a really big deal, his sort of success in boxing and as a professional athlete at the time. So that's a first example. So we're gonna fast forward now to 1953, and we have Mamie Peanut Johnson, who was one of, if not the first, Black female baseball player. And so, at the post-civil rights era, Black players were not allowed into the professional baseball leagues. Instead, they had their own league, the National Negro League. But as, Jackie Robinson, 1947 broke the color barrier, the National Negro League needed to find ways to keep viewers engaged. And so they started to actually bring in some female players as a way to try and generate some interest. And so other players like Tony Stone and Connie Morgan actually did play professional baseball for the National Negro League. And so these players, faced not only racism, but also sexism in how their femininity was constructed and the sort of stereotypes around female athletes' sexuality, as well as their race. So I wanted to show 2 clips about Mamie Peanut Johnson that will give us a better sense of what it was like for her. All right.
Got to be about about playing professional baseball. And then I just said, hey, I know I can't do this because they were only playing white black boys, you know. And the black boys not even players, so I know I'm not gonna make it there. So, you know, that I kept playing and playing. I said, okay, I'm gonna play baseball. Because that's all we had to do, Renee. But now, how is it? I mean, even in the South, in the rural areas of the South, whenever I didn't hear a lot of stories from my mother about little girls being allowed to play baseball with boys. Well, how did that happen? I was the only little girl there. And I played with the boys.
Now, these are all your kids who were
It's close by, you know. And there were a few girls close by my age. And she had a squall, which made squalls. But they didn't like baseball, and I did. So by us having the large, we had enough room for baseball. And no, you're not a big one, you know, but we had enough room, and all the little fellas would gather, you know, with my uncle and everything. And just when they played, I played, and I got mad if I didn't play, and I kept my grandma, and my grandma made him let me play. So, hey, that's all I did. Yeah, you know what?
I mean, today, you know, there's a lot of discussion about how young black kids aren't interested in baseball, don't have that love of baseball. How was it that those days, that in rural areas like that, and in urban areas also, there were so many black kids who loved baseball?
There's nothing else to do. We didn't have basketball. We didn't have football. We didn't have tennis. We didn't have that. All we knew was baseball. That's what we did. Because we made our own baseballs. With a rock, some twine, and some masculine tape. And you wrap it with twine. You know that intertwine?
Right.
You wrap it and you wrap it to a button.
All right, and then so she recently passed away, so I thought I would also share this was like a little.
Johnson passed away today. She was 82 years old. Mamie was the first female pitcher to play in the Negro Leagues. She's one of our own. Lived in D.C. since the 1940s. In 2008, her and other Negro Leaguers were drafted by major league franchises. She was drafted by the Washington Nationals. They released a statement, and I love the last line. Her trailblazing legacy of competition, grit, and risk-taking will never be forgotten. Now, when I think about what Mamie did for people like me, all I can say is, thank you.
All right, so you know I think it was important for me to to highlight historical examples, right? That where we see again racism, segregation, treated unfairly, prejudice, but we also see how the players were really empowered. That sport was a way to make a life for them and where they found value and meaning. And so this is like a recurring theme that was used, like trailblazer, you know, making change, things like that. Sport was becoming more and more a vehicle for raising awareness about social change and social justice. And athletes like Jack Johnson and Mamie Peanut Johnson were a part of that. So I think that is important to understand the history and see what was going on at the time. And now, you know, 1953, more and more we're seeing integration of sports. And I wanted to, I think, just talk a little bit, like to the group, pose these questions. You know, what was going on when you see, you know, the videos of these athletes? Like, how are you feeling? It makes them like real and personal rather than abstracted in the past. And then how are the experiences of these two athletes, you know, similar to what Black athletes might experience today, and how are they different? So we could just do a couple minutes, couple of responses to those questions from the group.
Well, I'll go first.
Sure.
I think you're referencing some amazing performances, some amazing athletes. It's just amazing they're able. That takes a high level of focus and concentration. It's even more amazing they're able to do that with all that pressure they're feeling about, when they're being stereotyped against and discriminated and not treated right and poorly. That they can still perform at that level with all that going on is absolutely amazing.
Which is also probably not that far off of what many Black athletes deal with today. I mean, we see that in the literature that explores, people of color's experiences in any, say, white-centered or historically white place. And so sport is not different. And so I would imagine that, many of the Black athletes, even as they are revered for their athletic abilities, still, and we're going to see, athletes from 2020, the summer of 2020, this is still something that they are, working with and carrying as part of, their identities and who they are, and still able to perform, just like you said, Charlie. Thank you. Anyone else? What were you feeling watching those, and what do you think is similar or different between then and now for our athletes? All right, well, we'll come back to that then. Thank you, though, for sharing out. So we move from 1953, social unrest continues to grow, and the civil rights movement continues to gain momentum. As we come into the 1960s, this was really reaching, sort of a crest of a wave. It was a time of unrest, protests against segregation and racism, which might sound familiar to many of us in summer of 2020, what's happening as well. And so there was a call for a boycott to the 1968 Olympics. And there was a very real possibility that the Black athletes for the US would not attend. In the end, the boycott didn't happen because they couldn't come to consensus about, whether everyone would go. And there was concern that if some didn't go, others would just take their place. So the boycott didn't happen. But what did happen, right, is an image that I saw in the Jamboard that we created, and arguably one of the most famous images when we think about sport and social justice. So we have Tommy Smith and John Carlos raise their fists in solidarity with the civil rights movement. And this was planned. I think that's important to know. This was not impromptu. This was something that had come from their involvement with the Olympic Human Rights organization that had sprung up in with the Olympics coming up. And so there's lots of symbolism in what they wore and what they did. They wore no shoes to symbolize poverty. They unzipped their jackets to stand with the working class. They wore beads to protest lynching. They have OPHR, which is the Olympic Human Rights Organization, badges. And then they had their fists raised to represent the Black Power movement. And I think it's important to also be aware that they faced immediate consequences that were quite swift and severe. At one point, one of them was homeless because he was unable to find work because they had been both deemed as risks that they were going to somehow, not be either reliable workers or that they were a danger because of their willing to step up and speak out in protest of racial injustice. So I have another little clip here that we'll watch about them, and that will help give us a little more context for what they're.
Olympic medal winner John Carlos and Tommy Smith raised their fists in the Black Power salute during the national anthem at the Olympic prize ceremony as a protest against racism in the United States. The moment is documented in the film Not Just a Game, narrated by sports writer Dave Zirin.
Here's the start. Carlos, entry point, first out of the box. Tommy Smith running pretty well so far. The late two Bronco is strong on the outside. It's Edwin Roberts. It's John Carlos right now. It's Carlos and Smith. And here comes Tommy Smith. Smith
bronze medal at the '68 Olympics, and what they did next couldn't stand in starker contrast to today's depoliticized, sanitized, and hyper-commercialized sports world. They didn't pull like Jordan at the 1968 Olympics and use their platform on the global stage to protect an endorsement deal. No. These guys had a point to make. As they walked to the platform, they took off their shoes and carried them to protest poverty in America. They wore beads to protest lynching, and John Carlos even unzipped his jacket, a violation of Olympic protocol, to represent, as he told me, his working buddies, black and white, back home in New York City. And in perhaps the most famous gesture in Olympic history, they raised their fists during the national anthem to show solidarity with the civil rights movement. The Black Power salute on the Olympic medal stand sparked controversy and career fallout. David Zirin's documentary film, Not Just a Game, also features an interview that John Carlos and Tommy Smith gave shortly after the Olympic incident.
Well, the next might say you've got it all. You've got publicity, you've got medals, you've got martyrdom as well. What are you going to say to that? I can't eat that. And the kids around my block, they grew up with me. They can't eat it. And the kids that's going to grow up after them, they can't eat publicity. They can't eat gold medals, as Tommy Smith said. All we ask for is equal chance to be a human being.
All right, so I'm going to stop there. So as you can see, they had like a very sort of pointed message and intention that, they wanted to make clear what they were standing for. And they were willing to risk, essentially their entire career to make a stand. They saw a platform. This was before, obviously, social media. And they took a stand. And they fell really hard for it. But that action, is still recognized, 50 years later as like this incredible moment in Olympic and really US history. So this was like sort of where I would argue there was a turning point, right, in the idea of sport as a vehicle for social justice. So when we think about this, just you can put in the chat or speak out, as a point of reference, whose parents or you yourself was alive in 1968? How long, who has one level connection to that? I know my parents were alive. What about other people's? Were your parents alive in 1968? Yep. So we've got a lot of connections, like one generation linked to this time. That's not that long ago. I think that is so important to remember that this, while it's history, it didn't happen that long ago. We have direct members of our family who are alive when this happened. Okay? And so that makes it important for us to see just how quickly things have changed and yet how far we have to go when we think about, what it was like for these athletes then versus what's going on now. Okay, so we're going to use that example in 1968 as the turning point where sport, suddenly it was, understood that sport could be a vehicle for social justice. And so we're going to fast forward now all the way to 2016. And probably, most of us now know what, Colin Kaepernick has become a household name for a very simple, quiet act. He simply knelt. And he was modeling protest through sport by saying, I want to play and I want to be a part of this team, but I also need to take a stand for what I believe in. And so, as we know, he faced very heavy repercussions. He was unsigned, most likely blackballed in the NFL. There had not been like a quarterback with his stats who had gone unsigned for that long of a time. There are some nuances to his story that I'm not going to get into, but I think the fact that he is still unsigned is an important, marker. He did, however, get a this commercial with Nike, and then that prompted another round of controversy. So we're going to watch the commercial. I was going to show the clip of him kneeling, but it's actually pretty, like, it's not as momentous as it seems, and it's almost hard to understand the outcry about it. So we'll watch the commercial and then some of the reactions to it. Okay, so give me a second here. Oops. Sorry.
If people say your dreams are crazy, if they laugh at what you think you can do, good. Stay that way. Because what non-believers fail to understand is that calling a dream crazy is not an insult. It's a compliment. Don't try to be the fastest runner in your school or the fastest in the world. Be the fastest ever. Don't picture yourself wearing OBJ's jersey. Picture OBJ wearing yours. Don't settle for homecoming queen or linebacker. Do both. Lose 120 pounds and become an Ironman after beating the brain tumor. Don't believe you have to be like anybody to be somebody. If you're born a refugee, don't let it stop you from playing soccer for the national team at age 16. Don't become the best basketball player on the planet. Be bigger than basketball. Believe in something, even if it means sacrificing everything. When they talk about the greatest team in the history of the sport, make sure it's your team. If you have only one hand, don't just watch football. Play at the highest level. And if you're a girl from Compton, don't just become a tennis player. Become the greatest athlete ever. Yeah, that's more like it. So don't ask if your dreams are crazy. Ask if they're crazy enough.
It's a pretty inspiring commercial, I think, and it really highlights, what Kaepernick was willing to risk in order to have his say about, what he was protesting. Now, to me, I think it's an incredible commercial, and I think it's beautiful. But Kaepernick's actions and his position have really become this emblematic of what conservatives often are fighting against. And so I wanted to show, I'm really sorry, we will only watch 30 seconds of it, but I wanted to show an example of a response to this ad, because while I always feel sort of close to tears hearing that and thinking about how important it is to stand up for what you believe in and to do things that are important to you, whether it's sport or whatever in your life. These are some of the responses. This is, an example of how other people responded to it. So we're just going to listen to 30 seconds. Fox News.
As Nike has selected Colin Kaepernick to be the new face of Nike for the year, the Just Do It campaign.
You can see right there, the caption is believing something, even if it means sacrificing everything. Usually companies and brands avoid taking strong public positions that could alienate their buyers.
Yeah, times have changed though, right?
And just take a look at our friend, country musician John Rich. He tweeted this out yesterday. Our sound man just cut the Nike swoosh off his socks. Former Marine, get ready Nike, multiply that by millions. And you know what? After that, take a look at these images. People across the country, don't know how many, setting their Nikes on fire. They are upset that Nike would align themselves with the one of the NFL's most polarizing figures. Well,
all right, so we'll stop that because none of us want to hear any more of that. But it gives you a sense of, some of the public outcry and response to the action and then like resulting, ad campaign, that people are so scared of, what social protests and social justice might look like in sport, that they're doing things like burning sneakers and cutting up their socks and absolutely like refusing to think about what Colin Kaepernick's position might and experience might be like. So that gives you a sense of what, Kaepernick, I think, really ushered in this new era of, taking a stand, right? So do you remember what exactly he was protesting? He said it in multiple interviews. Can anyone, either in the chat or in the video, can you identify what it was that he was protesting against? So there it is. He did it during the national anthem by kneeling, but it was really to take a stand against police brutality against Black people, that he felt like this was a way to bring attention to that by kneeling, in that, you can be a part of something and still recognize its flaws. So while you don't have to apologize, whoever said that, you took a stab at it, which I appreciate, right? That he was, and really protesting, racism in America, particularly towards Black people. And so I'm seeing in the comment somebody who worked at a Nike factory store, we have people coming in to complain about the ad. So many people took this personally. They took it as a personal attack, when in reality, he recognized that he had a platform and a way to get his message across to a lot of people about very clear instances of overt racism that Black people face and endure in the US even today. So this was really stirred up a lot of emotion. Terry, did you want to add something? No, sorry. It's hard to keep track of sound. And so I really think that things started to change after this point. And in that, professional athletes began to take a stand. And so that brings us now to this summer, when we had a culmination of horrific police brutality against Black people that led to widespread demonstrations and social upheaval, social unrest, and social change. And sport was a part of that. Okay, we had Naomi Osaka, who is a Black and she's half Japanese, half Haitian tennis player. She's the winner of the 2020 US Open. She is the highest paid female athlete, and she played while wearing masks with the names of Black people murdered by the police in order to raise awareness. And she said that this was a summer for her where she realized she was done being shy, and she actually saw improvements in her playing because she was able to be free and open and talk about what she believed in and what she wanted to take a stand for. And so we see the intersection of athletic performance and personal beliefs, that when you are free and when you can speak your truth, you can also be an even more high performing athlete, which is incredible. And she was playing in the Western and Southern Open, and she said that she wasn't going to play until the WTA released a statement about what was going on and what Black people are experiencing in the United States. And they canceled the tournament for a day, released a statement, and then she agreed to go back and play. So she used her sort of power as the top draw to the tournament to say, no, you need to address this. You have to take a stand here. Okay. And finally, we have the WNBA protests and boycott in the summer of 2020. And the WNBA is particularly active in social justice endeavors. And they were really considered the forerunner for the NBA protests and boycott that happened subsequently. And so I wanted us to listen to Natasha Cloud, who was a part of the Atlanta Dream. So we're going to hear, she opted to sit out for the season rather than participate. And then she weighs in on one of the co-owners of the Dream is a Republican white woman senator who was really strongly against the protests and the league's support of Black Lives Matter. So here is Natasha Cloud talking about her experience.
Is responding to a letter from Georgia Senator Kelly Loeffler, co-owner of the Atlanta WNBA franchise, after she spoke out in opposition to the league's plan to promote the Black Lives Matter message when the season begins in late July. In a letter to the league, Commissioner Loeffler wrote, "In a time when polarizing politics is divisive as ever, sports has the power to be a unifying antidote. And now more than ever, we should be united in our goal to remove politics from sports." In a statement, the league said they will continue to use our platform, they say, to vigorously advocate for social justice. Senator Kelly Loeffler has not served as governor of the Atlanta Dream since October 2019 and is no longer involved in the day-to-day business of the team. Well, my next guest had a more straightforward response to Loeffler. "We don't want her," is what she said. Joining me now is Natasha Cloud from the WNBA's Washington Mystics. I don't think you can put it plainer than that. Thank you for joining us, Natasha. So, why'd you say that? Tell me.
We don't. We have such a powerful league built up of so many strong, independent, powerful females, and we find pride in ourselves and being inclusive. Our league being a safe space for everyone, regardless of your religion, your background, your walk of life, your sexual preference, any of those. We're a safe place for a lot of people, and in this very moment, we are using that platform and that leverage and the momentum that's behind this movement to continue to use our platforms and voices to be a voice for the voiceless. And that also means supporting Black Lives Matter.
All right, I gotta stop there so we can keep going. But you can see that, the WNBA in particular is intent on using their, getting their message across to people and promoting social justice through things like the Black Lives Matter movement. So this is a way in which the entire league, for the most part, has taken a stand. I realized I made a mistake. Natasha Cloud, as it said, plays for the Mystics, not for the Dream. That was my error. But it's a great example of, how, the more and more athletes that are coming forward with this, the more power they have as a collective community. And so that really came to a head, or not a head, but that really came even further when we think about, I don't have a slide for it, that's okay. Over the summer again, the NFL, several players created a video asking the commissioner to explicitly and openly apologize. So I thought I wanted to do that, and then a couple of discussion questions before we wrap up here. Okay, so let's watch, because I think this video is incredibly powerful as well.
George Floyd was like how many times to ask to listen to the words? What will it take for one of us to be worried about police brutality? What if I was George Floyd? 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 I am George Floyd. I am Breonna Taylor. I am Ahmaud Arbery. I am I am Tamir Rice. I am Trayvon Martin. I am Walter Scott. I am Michael Brown. I am Samuel LaForce. I am Frank Smart. I'm Philip White. I am Jordan Baker. We will not be silenced. It shouldn't take this long. So, on behalf of the National Football League, this is what we, the players, would like to hear you state. We, the National Football League, condemn racism and the systematic oppression of black people. We, the National Football League, commit wrong and silencing our players from peacefully protesting. We, the National Football League. Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter.
So that's a pretty incredible video of players using their collective power to ask for change. And the commissioner did respond, and he did, offer at least an apology. It's certainly not everything. but it was an example of, really high-performing players recognizing the value that they brought to their team and using that as leverage, right? That if you want us to play for you, then you need to do the things that we're asking. And particularly in a place like the NFL, which has, as we saw, 80%, the players are Black, that this was something that the players needed and that the owners need to start really thinking about ways in which, they're protecting their power and their privilege at the expense of the players. And so I wanted to just come back really quickly to the comments by Senator Loeffler. So she was calling for less politics in sport, and my thought was like, well, less politics for whom? And I'm wondering, how do power dynamics play a role in her argument? And then finally, why do you think the WNBA protests got overshadowed by the NBA protests? So does anyone have any thoughts about any of these questions?
I'd like to share if possible. I think one of the biggest things is my frustration. So thank you for highlighting this. My frustration comes in when they say things like, so of course, Laura Ingraham told LeBron James, shut up and dribble. And people have said things like, they're the athletes. I don't want to hear this. I come to see the sports. My number one thing I keep saying is, but they're taxpayers and they're voters. So why all of a sudden, because they have a platform where it goes viral and multiple thousands of hundreds of people see it, millions, why is that wrong if they speak out? They are still taxpayers and they still have a vote. So they have a right to be bothered by the things that are occurring. And so even with the WNBA and them being bothered by Senator Loeffler, they have a right to that. They still get to vote in this country. And so it just amazes me that because people have a certain position in entertainment, so whether it's movies, Hollywood, wherever, that they're expected to only do that thing and they're put in this box. But then if you go to college campuses, if you go in communities, we're telling everybody, get out and vote. Your voice must be heard. So only people who aren't famous, who don't have a large platform, only their voices can be heard. That doesn't make sense when we keep saying everybody's voice should be heard. We keep sending a mixed message, and I think it's very hypocritical. So when we say everybody, we need to mean everybody. And I teach in disability studies, so people from all walks of life, people who have disabilities, people from whatever social, organization or recreation or whatever. So you're talking about in religion and ethnicity and race and sexual orientation. I don't care what it is. If everyone has a voice, then that means everyone has a voice. But the power dynamics that you're asking about, it's supposed to be understood. If you are an athlete, you are, quote, owned by someone. They are in charge of you. You're at work. And you don't get to say these things at work. Those were the comments. But it was like, well, why not? They're still a taxpayer and they're still a voter. And those things still matter.
Those matter so much. Thank you for that. I think that is such an important contribution. And as Felicia's saying in the chat, it becomes a matter of identity politics, and how you self-represent and how you identify becomes politicized. It becomes regulated, controlled, and status quos are it's fought for them to remain. So, I think that Loeffler's call for less politics in sports is because for her, the status quo is fine. She's in the position of power. She's in the dominant position. Why does she want anything to change? So when you call for an apolitical stance within sports, you're really saying, I don't think things need to change, right? And so this is her unable to be able to see how her position and her power leads to the marginalization and subordination of the Black players. Thank you for that contribution. And so finally, yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to contribute to the discussion if I could.
I would love you to. Thank you.
Well, one of the things that I'm fully aware of is that America is an idealistic nation. We're built on the ideal that all men are created equal. But the founders of this country weren't equal to the slaves that built this country. And so a lot of times, the illusion of power has to do with believing that you're superior in some way. The statistics you put up at the beginning of this talk about 80% of the players in the National Football League and such a large percentage in the NFL being people of color, being black people, what has to be associated with power are economics. And because so much money is generated by professional sports, whether it's football or basketball, that really equates to so much money is generated by these black people, that what happens is that the people who generate the money are the people in power, not the people who pocket the money. But the illusion is that the person who pockets the money, like Leffler or any of the owners or any of the other people who benefit from what these black athletes bring in terms of economics, they are under the illusion that they have the power. What has happened is that collectively, the athletes themselves realize they are the people in power. They are the ones who generate the income, and that we have enough power to stop the income that you guys are receiving. So that's really part of the issue, that we don't want anyone to really recognize where the power, the source of power really is. The source of power, you can be an owner, but if you don't have anyone who wants to see what these black athletes can do, then no one will give you any money. And so when the black athletes realize they are the ones in power, it puts them in a position where not do they have a right because that's something that they've been given, they have a right because they are in power. We are empowered to be able to speak our mind, whether you want to hear it or not. And if you don't like it, then there's a consequence. We won't play.
Excellent.
That's all I want.
No, that is perfect. You should just run this session because you're speaking so powerfully and beautifully about the crux of the matter, which it comes down to the intersection of, I would argue, race, class, or socioeconomic status, and power. And so what we saw over the summer was the collective group of athletes realizing that together they had power. And the threat of boycott was enough to make the coaches and the owners and the managers really think twice about, what their positioning was and how to think about their athletes and who, at the end of the day, who does have the power in generating the revenue, which is the athletes and their skills and their athletic prowess. So thank you for that. I really appreciate that insight. So finally, we're out of time here. So what I hope to sort of demonstrate today was that, sport, while, historically being a place where athletes, black athletes in particular, were exposed to racism, it also has this potential for real social change and long-term impact, particularly around social media and the followers that professional athletes have. Yet, I would also argue that what we're seeing is sport is often a consumptive or consumer-driven and exploitative industry where black labor is valued, but the black players as human beings are not, and that power remains concentrated at the intersection of race and socioeconomic status. So I hope that you at least taking away from this some examples of black athletes who have used their collective voice in the pursuit of social justice, and a glimpse into the ideas in which race and class intersect in power dynamics to impact sport in the way that it is. I'm so